To show the process of hooking the rod to the piston, I have here a piston liner kit. This particular kit comes with a piston, rings, and a liner, and the piston and rings are pre-installed, factory installed inside the liner. So it's not necessary for me to install the rings and install the piston into the liner itself. What I do need to do with this particular system is to install the rod onto the piston so that it's a complete unit. To do that, first thing we would want to do is to notice where it says front on the piston, on the head of the piston itself. So line that up, know where that's at. It's on this side, so we'll call this the front of the engine. Also on the front of the rod is the word stamped front as well. So the front of the piston and the front of the rod, it's critical that the two of them be in relation to each other. The rod, as you can see, is not cut square across this way. The cap sits on at an angle, and also the head of the piston is not exactly, the fire dome inside is not exactly centered in the piston either. So it's critical to get those relationships in their correct position. So I'm just going to take a soft hammer, tap inside on the piston, just far enough so that I expose the wrist pin. The wrist pin is also pre-assembled. It's inside the piston already with the snap rings. This is the front. This is the front side of the piston. So I'm going to lay that up. And remove the snap ring. And then I'm going to push the wrist pin out of the piston just far enough so that I can install the rod. Now again, check, front on this side, front here, a little bit of assembly oil inside the wrist pin bushing. Down inside, piston pin pushes in very easily to lock the two together. Reinstall the snap ring. Push everything back down inside. Set it in line with the rest of them. I've got 1, 2, 3, and 4 here in a line, all assembled and ready to install in the engine block. I wanted to demonstrate, since the liners, pistons, and rings were pre-installed in the parts that we're going to put back in this engine, I wanted to quickly demonstrate some of the measurements you'd want to take if you were going to reuse your liner, your piston. Probably wouldn't reuse your rings, but you can measure those for end gap just to see. But some of the measurements that you'd want to take on these used parts if you were planning to reuse them. One of the first is your piston skirt diameter, and that is a measurement of the diameter of the piston. So you'd want to come down here and measure the skirt diameter of the piston. Make sure that that meets the specifications that are published in the book. Secondly, you would want to measure the wear inside your liner. To do that, you'd use a poppet type gauge that would go down inside, spring pressure, the little lock here, go down inside, let it spring out to the maximum length that it'll go, tighten down the screw and take a measurement of the inside of the liner. You would then be able to measure that as well and compare that with the wear specifications published in the manual. The piston talks about maximum taper, or inside the liner, it talks about the maximum amount of allowable taper. So you want to compare the top and the bottom measurements inside the liner to get an accurate picture of the taper inside. To measure ring end gap, it's the gap between the two ends of the piston ring when it's installed inside the liner. There's no real way to measure that unless you leave it off the piston, insert the ring down into the liner, and then center it so that it would be in a position where if it was on the piston, it would be similar. You can then measure ring end gap by using a feeler gauge and measuring the gap between the two ends. As the piston liner wears, the gap gets larger and larger and larger. But on a new liner or with a new ring set, you would want to measure that gap and make sure that you met the minimum specifications. This particular one is 13 thousandths is the minimum. And this one, of course, is worn, so it's much larger than that. But for a visual to see what it would be that you would be measuring, it's installed here. I'm going to illustrate how you install piston rings on this old piston. Again, these are pistons and liners that we're not going to reuse, but just to illustrate the process, I want to reinstall these rings. This is the oil expander portion of the ring. The oil ring is a two-piece ring. The expander goes on first underneath the oil ring, and then the oil ring goes over it. I always try not to line up the gap in the expander with the gap in the oil ring. And it's a kind of a thick ring, so I just use my thumbs to expand this one. Works pretty well. Carefully, not too far, because they will snap and break. And just work it around until you get the expander on the inside diameter of the ring. So that ring goes in the third groove down. Then there's two other rings, and this is a 3-groove piston. There are small dots in the top of the ring. This one has 2 in it. This one has 1 in it. Typically they go towards the top. Any markings or dots or small paint marks or anything like that go to the top. But when you get a new set of rings, there will be instructions on how to install them. So be sure to follow the directions that you receive with the new rings. This is a set of snap ring pliers, 2 small V grooves that fit down over the ring and expand it like this. Again, only expand it far enough to get it over the piston and into the groove. There we go. And number 1 in the same manner. There's a measurement here that's critical if you're going to use an old piston liner set, new rings. You want to measure at the ring land here. As the piston moves up and down, it works on the top and the bottom of the groove. So there's a space there that needs to be measured. between the piston ring and the piston itself. There's a minimum and a maximum specification. So on this one, the minimum was 2.5 thousandths or 25 10,000ths, and the maximum was 5. So now I've got the 5 thousandths here, trying to insert it. It's very tight, so that would be an acceptable limit on this one. And it's right at the acceptable limit of 5 thousandths on those ring grooves. So those are the measurements that you need to take before you commit to using an old piston and an old liner. We've got our rings installed on this old piston, and we're going to set the rings in the proper position. We never want all the ring gaps lined up in a line like this. So we'll rotate each one about 1/3 of the way around so that they're spaced evenly around the circumference of the piston so they don't all line up. Put the piston started down into the bore of the liner. We want to put some pre-lubrication on. Lubricate the rings. Make sure that they have lubrication during initial startup. Install the piston ring compressor here. And tighten it up securely to compress the rings into the grooves of the piston. With that snug, it'd be a simple matter of just carefully tapping the piston down, making sure that if there's any hang-up, if there's any ring that catches on the edge of the liner, that you stop and readjust this compressor to make sure that it's pushed completely in. If the ring catches on the edge of the liner here, it can very easily snap. And so that's why I caution you to make sure that it's completely compressed before you push it in. This shows on an old piston, old rings, and old liner, the process of installing those components together. If you were to decide on your engine to reuse the liner, reuse the piston, and only we're going to replace the rings, these are the measurements, these are the concerns that you would have as you put that back together with a new set of rings. Sometimes you do that, sometimes you don't put brand new liners and pistons and rings in, but I just wanted to show you the process if that's the course that you take with your engine.